We're here together in the Xavier Hufkens gallery with this fantastic series of ceramics, 17 figurines, titled The Devil Alive. This Staffordshire sculptures, the Staffordshire figurines.
Figurines, yes.
Where does your fascination comes from?
I've collected them for maybe 20, 30 years, right? And I don't collect art, but for some reason I've amassed this collection of Staffordshire sculptures. And the first one that I had was given to me by a friend for my birthday, which was a figurine of Christ standing with his hands tied behind his back and a loincloth on that was very low down. So it was a sort of this erotic Christ sculpture. But I didn't know anything about Staffordshire sculptures at that time, but I loved this thing, and I carried it around from house to house. And then I sort of was in some junk shop, because Staffordshire sculptures are not high art. They're very much art of the people. And you don't buy Staffordshire sculpture usually from art dealers. You buy it in second-hand or shops, right? I saw some more of these religious sculptures, and they had these flat backs, right? Which some of these are flat backs in the sense that they're made for the fire hearth to sit flat up against the wall, right? And you're only supposed to see them from one side. And I found this really intriguing in general, that these little sculptures were expressly made for the home in a kind of dull Victorian world when they were made, right? And I just started to buy loads of them.
And so you stopped buying them and started to make them yourselves?
Well, in COVID, I was suddenly given this year of nothing to do, because I was supposed to go on a tour of the world. I just released a record, and we were going to do this big tour. And suddenly we couldn't tour. And so I just started to find that I had the time to do stuff that I simply don't have the time to do as a musician. I was just sitting with one of my Staffordshire sculptures and looking at it and thought, it's not too hard to do one of these things. They're quite naive in their way. The actual sculptural shapes are simple, and it's very much a simple shape that's sort of painted on. And the painting itself was quite simple too. They were essentially weirdly mass-produced, naive art to some degree.
And in a way, you had a history in this as a teenager.
That's right. I used
you
to
were making.
Yes, I made ceramic figurines as a
was
teenager.
A bit in your let's say sculptural memory.
Well, exactly. And I was telling you before, but my mother, I did the ceramics in a when I was a teenager at a course that at my father's adult education institute. He had a ceramics course there. And so I did a 3-week course through sort of a holiday break at school, and learned how to fire ceramics and glaze to some degree, right? And my mother loved these they were little figurines. They were similar in a way. They were little figurines of melancholy. They were quite beautiful in their way, but I had a kind of facility with clay, you know. And my mother put these all around the house, and she had them around the house till the day she died at 92. And coincidentally, the day that she died was through the COVID period. And it was the day that I decided to go into this studio with this sculptor friend of mine and begin some ceramics, to begin this ceramic project that I had in my mind. And my mother died that day. She'd been ill. She was very old, and I was upset. And my wife said, "You just go and do your work." Right?
Yeah.
Go and do your work. And it was a beautiful thing for her to say, because I went to this guy's studio, Corin Johnson, who's essentially works in marble, big marble pieces. And he gave me a corner of his studio in London. And the moment I sat there, deeply sad on that day. The moment I started working with this clay, it just felt like something that I knew what I was doing, and I was just swept away by it. It was a very, very beautiful, healing sort of thing. And I'm the last person to say that art is therapeutic or anything like that, right? Art for me is not about my own personal pleasure or to make me feel better. When I went there, one of the things I really didn't want to do was to get involved in the art world, because I was a musician, and the track record of musicians getting involved in the art world is not good, essentially. It always feels to me unserious, in the sense that I have a lot of artist friends, and their whole life is in this, and it's not something that you do when you've got a couple of weeks off in between touring. So I decided to go in there and do something which was ceramics, which in my mind was craft. It wasn't art. It stopped before art, shall we say? And I made the first thing I made was a little vase, which is something that Staffordshire sculptures often are. There's utility to them. So it was a little vase, and attached to the vase there was a saint boiling in oil, but it wasn't any good. It didn't work, and I did that in a day, and then I came back the next day and I did another little spill vase, but which was a witch being burnt at the stake, right? So I kind of had my theme, but I didn't.
You were moving.
I was moving towards something, but that didn't work either. I just didn't like it. But I loved doing it, but I just didn't like the way it worked out. And then a couple of days later, I just woke up really with the idea of doing the devil, mostly because I was really excited about the idea of using red glaze. And I thought, well, I'd do a devil. He's like red, right? And so I went in, and the first one I did was the devil and the sailor there, which is an actual red devil, and that really worked.
From there on, the series was starting to build.
Yeah, so
the
first one was just the devil seducing a sailor, right?
Yeah.
God knows why that turned out to be that way, but it was it's quite a radical little ceramic piece, because it's quite happy and joyful in its way, but has a complexness about the theme that was that I enjoyed, a playfulness, but there was something going on underneath the whole thing.
But I'm happy that you used the word radical, because that's also something which came up in my mind when I had the occasion to see the whole series, as you had the capacity to give a twist to this tradition of this Staffordshire figurines, which are sweet, which have a kind of mostly decorative, pleasing aspect.
Yes.
Only by exception, there are maybe more tricky ones, but by exception. And you were capable to turn into this kind of homey tradition, or things which people needed in order to ameliorate their daily living conditions.
Yes, that's right.
To turn them into something which have almost a philosophical capacity.
Yeah, they ended up being acutely personal. Once I'd done one, I wanted to do more devils, and I am essentially a storyteller. That's the way all my songs are. My songs have their narrative. They always sort of telling some kind of story, and that's just the way I think. And so I think I did. Okay, that's the devil. Now I'll do him when he's a little younger. Slowly, a story started to evolve, where I had no understanding at all of any greater meaning to them whatsoever. I often find that in songwriting as well, it feels that you're concerned with structure, you're concerned with the sort of mathematics, the structure, the pleasing nature, of what you're doing primarily, and meaning is something that finds itself later on. I always think, especially with songs, I write a line and I don't know what it really means, and I just think that's such a beautiful line, and I pray to God that it will find some kind of meaning and not just be some random interesting set of words.
You brilliantly talk about it in the book with the interviews.
Right. Okay.
That's the way how you talk about there, the process of making songs and the whole, complexity of it.
We're off the track a bit, but there are people that read the newspaper and they read something and go, oh my God, that's a terrible thing, and sit down and write a song about it, right? So meaning comes first, and they use their facility with language to put forward their feelings about this particular thing. This is literally impossible for me to write in that way. My work comes from abstraction. It comes from the shock of an image that just leaps out at you as a thing that you see in your mind. My songs generally are several of these images, and which sort of meaning sort of stretches itself over, hopefully. And this was a little bit like that too. I wasn't concerned with what the story they were telling, rather than just making sure the little guy looked right and his shoulder was okay and all the rest of it. I guess what I'm saying is that meaning finds itself with these sculptures in a shocking, extremely vulnerable way, which I had no idea about at the time of actually making them.
For me, there is this kind of gentleness and eloquence also in it, and which means that there's inside them there is a big humanity.
People have to be able to see themselves in the work that you do, and these are essentially, as an idea, are based on the Catholic Stations of the Cross of Jesus moving through the various things that happened in the Passion, and he falls for the first time, or he carries the cross, and the reason why these become exercises in meditation for people who stand there is because they see themselves reflected in the story.
Just, we like to go a bit off track, but I try to go back on track. But through the figure of Robert Johnson, the great, fantastic artist Robert Johnson, as you know, and we do know, he got this kind of meeting with the devil, and he gave his soul to the devil, and in return he got the mastery of the blues.
Yes.
What did the devil give you?
Well, in this respect, that's a lovely question. I'm not going to be able to provide you with an answer that's anywhere as good as your question. But in this respect, I think that the devil gave me a kind of disguise. It was just a way of, I think, ultimately, even though I didn't really know this at the time, a way of coming to certain realizations about things that were happening in my life in disguise. So it was never me, but it was, in the end, very much so. And I guess that the devil was allowing me to look at certain things that went on through my life from a point of view of sin, by attaching a pair of horns to myself, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And would you mind if I also would say that from my perspective, there is also a very subtle sense of humor present in the whole series?
They're mostly comic until they're not.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
And then also talking, you say, okay, it talks about me, and the devil is the disguise. And while I was walking, indeed, as the Via Crucis, as a procession that you make, like having this relation with each one, and then you move on to the second one, and you move on to the third one. And then at a certain moment of time, you're in front of the devil in remorse, which then I think, okay, this is Nick.
Yeah.
That's there where you suddenly get into a kind of other layer, which adds to the biography of the viewer, but which enters completely in the biography of the maker.
Yeah, I think by that stage, the circumstances have sort of stripped this character of everything, really. So it wasn't intentional. I didn't think, all right, this one's going to be me.
No.
I just did the devil, but I did him in more contemporary clothing. The work is essentially secret, and the sort of engine, the engine of it is something that's not understood at all. There's this film that Andrew Dominic made called This Much I Know to Be True, which is of a film of me and Warren Ellis, who's in my band, recording, playing certain songs. And at the start, I have these before they were glazed.
Yeah.
I just made them, and I hadn't even really established an order for them or anything. And Andrew asked me to talk about each one. And there's a moment in the film where I'm talking about the devil killing his first child, that there is a genuine realization, or there was a sort of internal shock when I'm describing this, which is something I've never had to describe before, of what this thing was actually talking about in the end. And I don't think I'd completely finished the series when I was talking to him. And so I think the last one, The Devil Forgiven, maybe The Devil Bleeds to Death, I don't know. I don't think I'd done those two. But there was a palpable shock in telling that story on camera, because I'd not told it to anyone. I just made these things. Well, what I mean to say is I don't want that to sound like some sort of confection that I've added later on. It actually was like that.
By the way, in the film, it's fantastically beautiful how you take the unglazed sculptures, and one by one they're put on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And then you have the other one, and the next one,
Yeah.
and one more, and one more. It's of an extreme beauty from my perspective.
Yeah, he
as
did
the colors are absent, of course,
Yeah.
as the glazing still has to happen, but there is a kind of another set of imagination which is triggered in the eye of the spectator, according to me.
In what way?
Well, you as you feel whiteness, and is something which has, on the one hand, something absolute, something perfect, something
There was
untangible, but at the same time, the whiteness is the whiteness of a canvas. It's the whiteness of the sculpture.
Yeah.
It's an invitation to act and to respond, and to add layers and layers of meaning with layers of color.
So they're very different when they're white to when they're painted, and I think, to me, the humanity of them is in the painting. It's in the color and the kind of little faces. And
also, I think, like painting them, it's a form of caretaking. It's like about care. And in that sense, maybe we have to get a little bit back to music and arts and visual arts, let's say, or the sculptures. Would you agree if I would say that, if I think on music, it's something that you give, and like if you make these ones, is something that you ask to take care of? That it's about that you are in two different mindsets in terms of relationships.
it's exactly right. The thing about sculpture is it just stands there, and people walk up to it and say things about it, and it's completely vulnerable to the criticism of the onlooker, or the opinion of the onlooker. There's nothing to look after it except your own sort of love of the thing, right? This is very different than, as you say, writing a song. Writing a song is something that is entirely given away to the audience. But these, they feel acutely vulnerable to me. Or there's a sort of vulnerability that is, except the vulnerability or the fragility of them is their power. But they feel like my children, or I don't mean that in that way people say, my book is my child or anything like that. And they literally feel in that way, that and they feel unprotected. And it's one of the very beautiful things that Xavier said when he saw them in Finland. He said to Thomas, who was there at the time when I exhibited them in Finland with Thomas's stuff, I want to look after these things. That was his initial response. And I thought that was an extreme, I thought, my God, at least someone wants to do that.
Another thing, Nick, which we didn't touch upon yet, indirectly, yes, but it's of course also in the press text, in the press release, you have been mentioning that this body of work has been important in terms of forgiveness, absolution.
Yeah.
You know, your relation with faith, religion, spirituality, you have a very unique, according to me, very unique and personal take on it.
I do. I think my religious leanings are unique, but only because they're not particularly well formed. and the general direction, I would say, of my religious feelings is toward the commonplace. The thing about belief, I find, is that you, for a rational sort of human being, sort of bred in a secular society, essentially, there's so much. It's so difficult to believe, right? It's so difficult. You're constantly knocking up against things that just don't make any sense, right? And I'm not someone who can kind of give myself over to something in a wholesale kind of way. So I think I make a slow journey towards the idea of God, but are constantly sort of knocking up against things that I have to work out that are the embodiment of some kind of truth. And this is a complex thing. It's not, but there is definitely a movement in that direction, and this helped me. This has helped me in religious terms to move close, to move more in that direction. It's a strange thing to say, but I think that often art itself is the way of articulating these profound ideas in a way that I can understand.